Bom dia a todas e a todos. O nosso evento hoje vai ser conduzido em inglês, então eu vou mudar aqui para inglês. I will switch to English. It's a pleasure for Bruno, Giovanni and I to have Pascale with us today. Pascale worked at the World Bank for more than 20 years, where she served as the Chief Suspension and Debarment Officer, and more recently as VP of Integrity. I will let Pascale tell in detail what these areas do in a bit. She's also adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School. Personally, Pascale is a very important person in my career. I know her for many years now. I remember back in 2010, I was working with compliance for some years. I was living in DC and I got a job offer from a prominent DC firm, and I went to talk to her at the World Bank to have a coffee and talk about career, what I should do. And she said, you know, you should go back to Brazil right away. This thing is going to grow globally. You need to be back in Brazil, and I'm very happy I could not have made a better choice. So thank you, Pascale. And with no further ado, unless Giovanni or Bruno want to make any comments, I'll pass to Pascale. He will walk us and talk about the investigations and sanctions at the World Bank and multilateral development banks.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you very much. Let me just put this on a slideshow. And
just one comment. We will have a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to send your questions to the chat, and we will address at the end as much as we can.
Sounds good. Okay, so let me just do one thing here with the slides. No. There we go. Okay, so let me move this over. So today, first of all, thank you very much, Carlos, as well as Bruno and Giovanni for inviting me to speak to your audience at the IBRADEM, which is an institution that I've been following for many years, through Carlos and also Bruno, over the years, and now I'm very glad to also meet Giovanni. So it is very true that Carlos, that so many years ago, the international anti-corruption was really not on the map anywhere, right? Which is why I think it would be good to start with a little history of where international anti-corruption comes from. But by way of introduction, first, World Bank Group, which is what we're going to be discussing today, investigations and sanctions at the World Bank Group. World Bank Group, what is it? It's an international organization. It's owned by pretty much every single country in the world, and it gives financial assistance and technical assistance to developing countries. Its goal is to reduce poverty and also to what they call boost share prosperity, which is really another way of saying doing something about inequalities. One thing that is good to know for your general information is that whenever somebody speaks about the World Bank Group, in fact, one means 5 organizations. So when one speaks about the bank, those are the lending parts of the World Bank Group, who talks about the IBRD and IDA. But there is also the International Finance Corporation that many of you may have dealt with or heard about, and that's a private sector arm of the World Bank. And they help private sector development in developing countries. And there's also MIGA, which is a multilateral investment guarantee agency, which gives political risk guarantees to investors and lenders. The idea is that if you give political risk guarantees, it's going to attract more money to come into developing countries. And then last but not least, the World Bank Group also encompasses the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, ICSID, which is the arbitration arm of the World Bank Group. So like I said, a very short history of international anti-corruption law. When I went to law school in Belgium, which is like, you know, many, many years ago, one didn't speak about, you know, maybe corruption might have been mentioned one day, or fraud or something like that. Fraus omnia corrumpit, it would say, you know, Latin sayings one would learn in a Belgian law school. But international corruption definitely was not something that, you know, was on the map, or that, you know, people would talk about. So international anti-corruption as a movement really starts with the Watergate scandal. So in the 70s, America was in the throes of, you know, the Watergate scandal. President Nixon ended up, you know, resigning because of it, and so that was a political scandal. Through that political scandal, it turned out that the investigators that were looking at the political scandal also realized that there were all these US multinationals that had been paying campaign contributions, and that these campaign contributions came out of a slush fund, and that those same slush funds were paying foreign government officials. And so the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice, you know, said, well, that's not a very good thing that, you know, American companies are paying, you know, out of slush funds, you know, foreign government officials. To make a long story short, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act became a direct result of the Watergate scandal. A lot of people don't know that. And here on this picture, you see Prince Bernhard, who was the consort of the Queen of the Netherlands, and he had actually received bribes from Lockheed Martin. So that was one of the recipients of these, you know, slush funds that the multinationals were using. So the moment that the Americans are forbidding their own companies to pay a bribe to foreign government officials, you can imagine that after a while, right, US private sector was saying, well, hey, how about the French, the Dutch, right, the Belgians? Can they pay bribes? If they can continue paying bribes, and if it used to be that not only could you pay a bribe as a, say, Belgian company to a foreign government official, you could also tax deduct it. So needless to say, that wasn't a very good thing in terms of leveling the playing field for, you know, competitive reasons for the US. So the US then pushes the OECD in 97 to, and the OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and basically in 97, it would have contained, or it did contain, all the big trading partners. So it's the club of all the rich countries, right? Of in the late 90, you know, just before 2000. So OECD passes a convention that forces all the OECD countries, all the US trading partners, to have a similar law to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And around that same time, not surprisingly, the US, but also Transparency International, pushed the World Bank to start doing something about anti-corruption as well. The moment that all the rich countries are covered, the rich countries of that time, right? Because there's other emerging markets that came up afterwards, the OECD countries then pushed the other countries around the world to have a similar law to the FCPA, a similar international agreement. And that was then the origin of the UN Convention Against Corruption, which came about in 2005. And then as a result, you know, by 2005, the whole world is covered by an international convention, which says it is not okay for a company to pay a bribe to a foreign government official, because it was always illegal to pay a bribe to a local government official, but not to a foreign government official. And then what's interesting is that you see that the moment that you have an international agreement, other countries then follow suit with FCPA type laws. So you have, you know, UK Bribery Act, you have the French SAPA 2, you know, and others. So that is just to show you, draw a picture of how a US law, right, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act from the 70s, really started an international movement. And these days, in most countries, it is prohibited for a national country to pay a bribe to a foreign government official. So we're going to go back to the World Bank. And why is it, right, that an international organization would be involved in the fight against corruption? And everything that I'm going to tell you about the World Bank very much applies as well to the other multilateral development banks, notably African, European, Asian, and Inter-American, because they're very similar rules, and I'll speak about that a little bit at the end. So all countries are subject to corruption, right? I mean, you open the paper, I open the paper, I live in America, I open the paper every day, I see corruption scandals, right? Local scandals. I open the paper and, you know, I look at papers from other countries, there's corruption scandals everywhere in the world, right? Unfortunately, the more a country is poor, right, and the more the institutions in a particular country are weak, the more corruption will actually, you know, really become a thing, will become, you know, will get a bigger foothold. So there's nothing like some photographs to show why for an institution that fights poverty, and all multilateral development banks, you know, fight poverty, why it is important for them to look and be interested in fighting corruption. So on the left-hand side is a design of a hot spring spa for an ecotourism center. And on the right-hand side is the status after 50% was disbursed, with only 30 days left to completion. So instead of, you know, look at the left-hand side, instead of, you know, the nice hot springs water or pool, you know, the right-hand side is like, you know, some type of a mud bath, not very attractive. Same thing for the hotel. So obviously, in this case, the developmental purpose of building a nice, you know, eco center that we're going to attract tourists and bring, you know, more prosperity to that region, obviously that was not achieved. In general, whenever there is corruption, results will literally disappear. I thought this picture was particularly good because when you have a project that is, you know, corroded by fraud and corruption, the contractors and the government officials will cut corners, right? The road will not be laid properly, right? The concrete will not be, you know, not have the consistency that it's supposed to have. If there's an earthquake, you know, the buildings will fall down. You know, if there's any type of a landslide, you know, the road, you know, is gone. So what happens too is that whenever there is corruption, the donor countries will start losing trust, and that could, you know, cause problems with the financing of the international organizations. And if the financing of the international organizations is in trouble, then obviously that's not good for the poor countries, which potentially might get less money. Showing another couple of pictures. So here are some examples of you know, cars that were bought too early and that, you know, were defective, pumps, water pumps not working, you know, projects, education projects where, you know, the kids, in fact, you know, never get the school books. One of, you know, the all-time favorites in a bad way was these baby incubators, which were supposedly brand new, and look at, you know, what shape they arrived. I mean, if you were to actually put babies in there, I don't think that would be a very good idea. Yet, if there is no fraud and corruption, right, then classrooms will be built according to quality standards. You know, the roads will be built properly. The kids are going to get, you know, their school books. So there's a reason I started with a picture before showing you the economic and the legal reasons. But the moment that you see those photographs, you really understand, right, why international institutions, you know, started caring about corruption. So the economic reasons, IMF, for instance, said that the annual cost of bribery alone was a massive $1.5 to $2 trillion. Numbers fly about, right? I personally am not an economist, so I don't know whether it's, you know, 2 trillion, 5 trillion or whatever. It's a lot of money, right? It will also depend on the country. In some countries, easily 75%, will disappear on some projects, or the projects, not. The point is that it's a large amount of money that disappears. And at the end of the day, it's often, taxpayers' money, right? Both with bilateral aid and with, international aid. Then there's also legal reasons why international organizations started getting involved, and that is that in the Articles of Agreement of the World Bank, it actually says that the World Bank must use all the funds with due attention to considerations of economy and efficiency, and the money needs to be used for their intended purpose. And when you saw those pictures, obviously, the money was not used, for intended purposes. So enough about that in terms of, background. Now let's look at a project, and I understand that most of you are lawyers on the as part of the audience. So we're going to go into a few legal relations. How are all the parties related? So assume that the World Bank gives a loan agreement to Kenya. I used to be the lawyer on Kenya at one point, so I always use Kenya as an example. So assume that the World Bank, look at the left-hand side, gives a loan agreement, $200 million to build roads in Kenya. That money will arrive in the Kenyan treasury, and that money will then be used to enter into literally thousands of contracts with companies and individuals in Kenya or abroad, who are actually going to build those roads. And in the loan agreement between the World Bank and the borrowing country, so imagine a loan agreement between the World Bank and Brazil. In that loan agreement, it will say, Brazil, by receiving this money, you promise that you will follow the World Bank's fraud and corruption rules. And then in the contracts between the borrowing country, say in this case Brazil, and the companies and individuals that are going to build, implement the project, in those contracts, the same fraud and corruption provisions appear. And that is what gives the bank the right to investigate, to audit these contracts, to audit the companies, and also to impose sanctions if it turns out that fraud and corruption was present. So I wanted to point that out so that you see where the contracting relations lie. Okay, a little bit about terminology, because in international organizations, I've always thought that it was interesting. It has sort of its own language, right? Its own terminology. So when one speaks about sanctions outside international organizations, one thinks about UN sanctions, right? Not in international organizations. Sanctions at the World Bank and the other NDBs actually means suspension and debarment. And so a suspension and a debarment means that a contractor will not be allowed for a number of years to receive contracts financed by the World Bank. So a contractor will become ineligible to receive new contracts. That's what a suspension and debarment means. Also, to clarify, sanctions, suspension and debarment are administrative remedies. It's not a criminal sanction. An international organization does not have criminal authority. So who can be sanctioned? Companies and individuals that receive World Bank finance contracts. If World Bank staff members are on the take, there's another system that applies, so they'll be investigated and they will be fired. If one talks about, if it becomes clear that a member country, government official is involved, those will not be debarred, with one exception. But what happens there is that there'll be referral reports made to the particular country. So the one exception is that if a government official sets up a company on the side, in his name, his wife's name, his cousin's name, whatever, and then walks and talks like a regular company, that company obviously could be debarred. But in general, because this is important, right? Often one hears, well, international organizations only go, after the companies, but then don't do any, which is, what they call the supply side, the ones that, pay the bribes, that give the bribes, right? But there's also the demand side, and that is the member governments. And so it's good for people to know that whenever there is an investigation, a summary, so the INT, Integrity Vice Presidency, so the investigators of the World Bank, they will make a referral report to the finance minister or other designated national authorities after an investigation was concluded. And so that's important to know. If you look at the annual reports issued by the World Bank, for instance, you will see a list of where referral reports were made. I think that is a good information to have. So in the sanction system, so the debarment system, who does what? So you see here 4 different distinctive players. So you've got on the left-hand side, the investigative side. In the middle, you have the adjudicators. And then on the right-hand side, you have compliance. So a case will start with an allegation that is received by the Integrity Vice Presidency, which again are the investigators of the World Bank. So they will receive the allegation, will look at whether or not this is a credible allegation. If so, an investigation will ensue. And if at the end of the investigation they think that there is enough evidence, what they will do is they will prepare a legal document, which is called a statement of accusations and evidence, and they will send it to the suspension and debarment officer. So look, one level over on the adjudicative side. And so the Integrity Vice Presidency will also make referrals to the national authorities, as I just mentioned. Then the first tier, so the adjudicators has a first tier and a second tier. The first tier is suspension and debarment officer. And so Carlos mentioned that I used to work there. I set that office up, about 13 years ago. And that suspension and debarment office really functions as the administrative judge of first instance. So what they will do is that they will determine the sufficiency of the evidence. They will see is there or is there not sufficient evidence that was presented by the investigators. If they think that there is sufficient evidence, then they will present the case to the respondent, to the company or to the individual. And at that moment, the company will be suspended. And that means that the company will no longer receive new contracts. And the contractor, the company, then has 90 days, actually first has 30 days to sort of make a mini appeal called an explanation. And when the SDO receives the explanation, which is like the mini appeal, they, he or she can actually pull the case or lower the sanction, which happens once in a while. The company can also appeal to the sanctions board, and they have 90 days to do that. If the company does not appeal to the sanctions board, and this happens in about 2/3 of all the cases, then the sanction that is recommended by the SDO becomes the final sanction and the case is over. If, however, the company appeals to the sanctions board, so this happens in 1/3 of all the cases, then this sanctions board will look at the case. And there, the system is different because at the level of suspension and debarment officer, you have a World Bank appointed official. At the level of the sanctions board, you have 7 external judges, including the chair. So these are people that are completely independent from the World Bank. They, at that level, a hearing may be held, and also they could see witnesses. The sanctions board will then determine, same thing, whether sanctionable practice occurred. They're not bound by the decision that was made by the SDO. And then very important to remember as lawyers, the sanctions board decision is final and it's not appealable. So once a company has been debarred, the case goes over to the integrity compliance officer. And there I'm going to show you another slide later on so that you understand how the ICO Integrity Compliance Office works. So a little bit about the sanctionable practices. So many of you that are interested in this field, otherwise you would not have signed up this morning, you're familiar with FCPA type laws, right? And FCPA is payment of a bribe, right? Or a thing of value, and also, you know, incorrect accounting practices, right, related to that. Now, at the World Bank, it's much more than that. So you have fraud. Corruption is what, you know, would be similar to an FCPA type of violation. But at World Bank, you also have fraud, so any type of, you know, omission, misrepresentation, you know, lying, coercion, for instance, holding up a competing contractor up in his bathroom at gunpoint so that the guy can't go to the bid opening. That's actually a case that I heard of. Doesn't happen often, but has happened. Collusion, bid rigging. So antitrust type situation happens quite often, especially in countries where there's, you know, a much smaller market, where there's, you know, low entry to market. And then the last sanctionable practice is obstruction, which is, you know, lying to investigators, you know, shredding documents as the investigators are walking in. That's also one that apparently has happened once. And also, and that is important to remember as a practitioner, preventing, or, you know, to read here from the slide, materially impeding the exercise of the bank's contractual rights of audit. What does that mean in plain English? If a company does not allow the integrity vice presidency, so the investigators, to exercise the World Bank's audit rights, that fact in and by itself is grounds for debarment. And that was obviously something that was important to add, because initially there were only 4 sanctionable practices and obstruction was added later, because some companies would simply, you know, refuse the rights, the bank's right, the World Bank's right to audit, and they thought the case would be over. So the mere fact that a company does not allow the World Bank to exercise its audit rights is grounds for debarment. Needless to say, that has prompted companies now, you know, to cooperate. So the types of sanctions. So we've already spoken about debarment. There's also a letter of reprimand has happened, you know, a couple of times. Restitution has also happened, but not as much as you might expect, especially when, you know, you're used to seeing you know, FCPA type, you know, situations. Now, the type of sanction that is used the most is called a debarment with conditional release. And so that means that a company will be debarred, say for 2 years, and that before it will be undebarred, before it will be taken off the public debarment list, it needs to put in place certain conditions, which is putting in place a compliance program and also continuing to assist, cooperate with the investigators. And this is where the integrity compliance officer comes into play, and there's a slide about that. I'll go into that in a little bit. There's also another type of sanction that has been used a little bit more over the years, and that is called a conditional non-debarment. And that, as the word would say it, a company is not debarred on condition that it has fulfilled certain conditions, which is usually, you know, a compliance program. And that would, a conditional non-debarment, I would compare that in the FCPA context to a declination, right? Or in the US debarment context to a company that has been found to have been, you know, quote unquote, presently responsible. But so right now, the sanction that is used the most is a debarment with conditional release. So how does it work, a debarment with conditional release? So the SDO, the suspension of debarment officer, so the admin judge of first instance, if there's no appeal, or if there's an appeal, the sanctions board will issue a decision. And then the start of the debarment, and it says usually 3 years. So on average, it's been around, 3 years. The debarment level is based on sanctioning guidelines. So if you look at the World Bank's website, you can go find the sanctioning guidelines, and it will show you that the debarment always starts at 3 years, and then the years of debarment can go up depending on aggravating circumstances. So for instance, high-level government officials involved, high-level people in the company involved, all of these would be aggravating circumstances. Or the level of debarment, the 3 years can go down if the company is cooperating or if it's put in place a compliance program. So, but for the purposes of this slide, a company has been debarred. It now receives a letter from the ICO, dear company, you've been debarred, you need to start working with us. And so then the ICO, Integrity Compliance Office, which is a separate independent office, it's housed in INT, but it's independent in terms of its decision-making. And the Integrity Compliance Officer will start working with the company. And that company will be debarred until the Integrity Compliance Officer says, you have now complied and you now have a compliance program which passes muster. And if within, say that a company was debarred 2 years, if within the 2 years, the ICO, which currently is a person called Lisa Miller, if Lisa Miller says, okay, company, you have put in place a good compliance program, then the company is released from the debarment and it can re-engage in World Bank business, they can receive new contracts. If, however, the ICO decides that the company has not put in place a good compliance program, then the company remains debarred until the ICO decides that indeed the company has put in place a compliance program, a proper compliance program. Now, you might be interested to see what is it that is required, right, under the compliance, the World Bank's compliance guidelines. So if you're looking, here's another slide that summarizes. It's nothing particularly new, right? So if you're dealing with clients, as if you're a law firm or if you're in-house as a compliance officer, if you're having a compliance program already, you will find that what you have, if it's a proper compliance program, pretty much, is the same as what is required by the World Bank. An international organization, in my experience, will never make up something from scratch, right? An international organization will always go and look, okay, what do the national countries have, right? And so in the case of the World Bank, it looked at institutions, for instance, such as Transparency International, but it also looked at the OECD guidelines. And so if you compare what the US is requiring, right, what the French are requiring, the Brits are requiring, what international NGOs such as Transparency International are requiring, or what the World Bank are requiring, you'll see that pretty much over the years, everything's been benchmarked, right? So in the case of the World Bank, as would be the case with regular compliance program, you have to have provisions that are going to avoid the corruption, the fraud and corruption from happening. Once there is an issue, you have to have a system whereby, you have to have a system whereby issues will be detected, right? As a company, you can't just sit by and relax and say, well, let's just cross our fingers and hope nothing happens. No, a proper compliance program has systems embedded in the compliance program that are actually going to ensure that, issues will bubble up and that, the compliance officers will know about it. It must allow for investigations of any type of misconduct that arrives, and obviously for the remediation of any issues. And now what's important as well is that, and I've seen this happening in national contexts as well, it's important to tailor the compliance program to the particular situation of a company, right? a 20-person, mom and pop company is not going to have the same compliance program, right, as a multinational. I think the thing to remember that is the most important, and you hear this very much also from national authorities, for instance, in the US context. The important thing is for a company to do its own risk assessment, to do a very profound risk assessment. Where are our risks? Where are the contact points with government officials, and then adapt the compliance program around the particular risks of the company. One thing that I wanted to point out with the World Bank is that as part of the compliance program requirements, it very much encourages collective action. And so the other day I saw this slide. I thought this was pretty cool. And so collective action is something that we've been seeing over the in the area of international anti-corruption over the past so many years. I think it's a good idea, as long as obviously the companies don't run afoul of any antitrust issues. But the more the merrier, right? For international business associations, to be involved collectively to fight corruption. And for instance, IBRADEM would be one of them, right? I've seen the same in engineering associations, the Basel Institute on Governance and the OECD, for instance, also have been doing things on, collective action. It's something, TI, Transparency International, same thing. I find that there is a lot of merit in that, especially for smaller companies, because that will give, more of a standing, right, in front of government officials if the company ventures into, jurisdictions that where there's more problems. Back to the consequences of a debarment. Any debarment decision is made public. So the decision itself is published. The SDO decisions are published. There's smaller things. I always thought it looked more like a boring press release. It's very short. And the sanctions board decisions are more like a regular judicial decision. They're longer, they're reasoned, they're fully reasoned, and they've done something very good. They have a law digest, and they just came out last year with a supplement to the law digest, and they very easy to use, and a very useful document if you want to have an idea of the sort of issues that have come up. There's also usually a press conference, press coverage, not a press conference. Maybe the company will hold a press conference. So whenever a company is debarred, this depending on the name of depending on the company, depending on the country where it was, there can be quite a bit of publicity. Cross-debarment. So many years ago, by now, 10 years ago, I mean, Carlos, that's when you and I first spoke, 2010, right? So what happened was that the multilateral development banks, so the Africans, Asian Development, Europeans, Inter-American, and the World Bank got together, and they signed what is known as the cross-debarment. So whenever one of the MDBs debars a company for more than a year, automatically or semi-automatically, that company is debarred by all the other multilateral development banks. So say a Brazilian bank is, say a Brazilian company is debarred by the World Bank for more than a year, it will automatically be cross-debarred by African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and Inter-American Development Bank. So if you're a company that does business in emerging markets, a debarment is really something that one needs to try and avoid, right? Because that could potentially take out a big chunk of your business, in addition to the negative publicity. So over the years, I mean, there's been more than 250 cross debarments. The names of all the debarred entities are published, and you can search it per firm's name, the address, the country. So for instance, if you go to worldbank.org/debar, make sure that it's with 2 R's. Don't ask me why it's 2 R's, but it's 2 R's. Worldbank.org/debar. If you type that in, you can type in Brazil, and it will show all the companies in Brazil that were debarred. It also will show the entities that were cross-debarred, right? That would make sense. And what's interesting is that that list, I checked it the other day, it's a PDF, so you can download it. Which has made it so that, for instance, World Check and other due diligence companies, they take over the names, from these lists, and they add them to their cross-check list. So we're getting at the end, and enough time for Q&A. But I just wanted to mention that so we're 43 years after the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right? Where are we? We're at a time now where the whole world is covered by excellent international treaties, right? So you have the OECD, and you also have, the UN Convention Against Corruption. But yet, many challenges remain, right? As we all know in our own, practices, because maybe not all countries, will apply this, quote unquote, level playing field with the same amount of enthusiasm, right? Companies may say, hey, you're doing a lot about the supply side, but you're not doing enough about, the demand side. It does remain very difficult, for some companies to do business in certain jurisdictions. So this is what, we call the asymmetry between, the active and the passive, corruption. And then one thing that I've noticed with COVID right now, with COVID-19, is that there's always going to be a tension. I'm talking now about both national situations, right? But especially international situations with countries or international organizations, making available funds. Whenever there's an emergency, and so COVID-19 definitely would be an emergency, there's always going to be a tension, right, between making the money very quickly available, right? Give them the money they really need it, and making sure that proper safeguards are in place. And so I'm part of a couple of organizations or loose associations that look into anti-corruption, and this is something that is keeping people very very awake and concerned, because with the massive humanitarian issue that you have, with the pandemic, a lot of public funds are made available, sometimes too quickly, sometimes not enough safeguards, and so it's just a matter of time before there's going to be, because the pandemic at one point will go away, and the economy in the meantime will not have improved, right? And so for companies right now, I think it's very important to make sure to do things properly, because the prosecutors, the investigators definitely are continuing to look into issues, and you don't want to be held holding the bag at the end. So thanks for your attention. And Carlos, you said 9:45, and it's 9:45, 10:45 with you guys. So time for Q&A.
Thank you, Pascale. That was sharp. Thank you very much for your explanation and comments. It was very helpful. We do have some interesting questions that came from the chat. Bruno, Giovanni, do you want to pick up on that?
Yes, thank you, Pascale. It was really excellent. I want to say as well that we are very honored to have you in our Anti-Corruption Compliance Committee here. I wanted also to thank you for convincing Carlos back in 2010 to come back to Brazil. I didn't know that, but it was really good. Thank you for that.
Some coffee conversations have long effect. I distinctly remember that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's let's start with the questions. We have a very good question from Guilherme Donega. He's currently at the Inter-American Development Bank. He worked previously at the Transparency International in Brazil, and we at DipreDemp had the chance to partner with Transparency International as well in some very good projects. So the question is the following. I want to hear from Pascale her views on the establishment of compensatory funds as means for strengthening anti-corruption initiatives in civil society. What have been the learnings from the Siemens Integrity Initiative, and why haven't we seen these mechanisms spread across more recent sanctions and negotiated resolutions?
Do you want to take like 2 or 3 and then do some in a bunch, or I can answer question per question? I'd be happy to do that.
Well, perhaps you can start with this one.
Okay, I will start with that one. So for those people that are not familiar with the Siemens Fund, Siemens, you may remember, was a company that got into a bunch of trouble, many years ago, and it had a resolution with, the US and the German authorities. And on the side, it also had a settlement with the World Bank. And as part of that settlement, Siemens had to put $100 million in an integrity fund, and that integrity fund, which is managed by Siemens, but it had an approval by the World Bank as needed. That money needed to be used for integrity purposes. And over the years, many anti-corruption NGOs and institutions have, used that money. And so the question is, why not do this again? And so this is something that has come up over the years, and there's some people that are very much for it, and you won't be surprised, many people that are very much, against it. I no longer am with the World Bank, so I can speak as a free woman. But even when I was at the World Bank, I could see both sides, right? When you set up an integrity fund for an international organization, obviously it comes with a lot of, additional responsibility, right? Who is going to decide where the money is going to go to? And one thing that is always very much on the minds of, the decision makers is, what's going to happen if that money goes, to an NGO or goes to a country and is then again misused, right? That is like, a big fear. At the same time, I must say, I mean, from speaking as a private person, I sort of think that there is something very nice about the fact that, money that may have been tainted by corruption that then is used, to fight corruption. I think there's something poetic and something, very, very nice about it. So I personally think that it's a good idea. Whomever does it obviously needs to be ready for, making sure that money gets, well managed, right? And that there is a very transparent process, not only for receiving the money, but also then, spending the money afterwards. I wouldn't be surprised that it's something that is going to happen more and more, because also in the national context, I've seen in some countries that some type of restitution has been used. For instance, I think the UK with Tanzania, and I've seen some other situations. So my bet would be that in the future that it will come back, yeah, and it'll become more mainstream.
Thank you.
We have. Go ahead, Bruno. Sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask you, Giovanni, if you have any.
I anticipated you. So we have questions on different topics, Pascale. So I'll just go for the first one from Felipe here. He asks, of course, looking at your when you were at the World Bank, if you know if the World Bank used AML mechanisms to prevent fraud, and if they have different provisions for the 40 recommendations or not. So it's interesting to look at another side of it.
So AML is not something that I would have been involved in on the sanctions side. So that is not an area that I would have followed. I mean, that is something that comes up more in the national context. Yeah. So I'm afraid that it's not my my specialty. Yeah. No, the World Bank. I mean, the controller's office will check amounts against UN sanctions, but that's the only thing I remember.
Yeah, and it's kind of looking a perspective as you mentioned, as an individual looking from the other side, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean at the World Bank, right? You know, it's important for people to realize what the World Bank has jurisdiction of, right, and what not, right? And that's why it's important to see what's the business of the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks, right? It receives money from rich countries, right? And then it lends out money to developing countries for development projects. And it's in those loan agreements, right? And anything attached to those loan agreements that it's going to focus on fraud and corruption. Also, it's important for an international organization to stick carefully, right, to those types of things which in advance were made sanctionable, right? Which in the case of the World Bank, it's fraud, corruption, collusion, coercion, obstructive practices, not anything else, even though the anything else may be really bad, right? Because one runs into horrible situations sometimes, but the World Bank does not have jurisdiction over those. The jurisdiction falls on the countries or maybe other international institutions.
Sure. And Bruno, we have another one here on the compliance reporting after the agreements. I don't know, Pascale, if that fell under your office here in terms of how the World Bank follows after any compliance agreements, the compliance of any agreements, the compliance obligations. So if it has regular meeting reports, or depending on according to which the complaint it has.
Okay, so the moment that a company has been released from compliance, the World Bank will not, or the Integrity Compliance Officer will not say like, you know, hey, I released you a couple of years ago, you know, how are you doing, right? So they're not going to look at that. However, right, as you might not be surprised, the moment that a company was in trouble before, right, was debarred. If it starts doing it again, the competitors will say, hey, you know, these guys are doing it again, and it won't be long before, you know, the investigators will receive allegations that, you know, a particular company is at it again, right? So, but it's not, the World Bank will not, you know, itself go and follow up once it's been released from debarment, right? During the period of debarment, obviously there is a lot of checking. Yeah, and in that regard too, to mention, so some in some occasions the Integrity Compliance Officer will require to have a compliance monitor, and that's also something that, you know, we've seen in different countries. In the US for a while it was quite popular. And then less, but for instance, the French on the SAPA 2, they're also imposing compliance monitors. And so a compliance monitor will be a private sector company. It could be a law firm, it could be an accounting firm that becomes the ears and the eyes of the government, right? Is paid for by the company, but its reports will go directly to the government. And in certain jurisdictions, that's not a bad idea, especially in countries where they're at the beginning of an anti-corruption, you know, compliance regime. Yeah.
Pascale, let me pick up on that. We had Ayres Bennett, who is the monitor for SNC Lavalin in previous events.
Yeah.
And why some of the monitorships are so long? So SNC Lavalin is like 8 years, right? And who knows what we're going to be doing in 8 years, right? And another question, one question that came here through the chat, if you can give us an idea by the time that you were at the World Bank, how many people does the World Bank have in each area, the integrity vice presidency and the office of suspension and debarment?
Okay, so I'll start with the how many people. So the integrity vice presidency has about, you know, running around 80 staff, something like that. Sometimes maybe more, 70, and plus a lot of consultants. So usually it hovers around, you know, 120, 110, 120. There are investigative staff, and there's also people that work on forensic accounting. People that work on prevention as well, you know, getting all the lessons learned together and sharing it with others around the bank. So that's for the integrity vice presidency. Amongst all the NDBs, the integrity vice presidency at the World Bank obviously has, you know, the most staff. Then Office of Suspension and Debarment, there is the suspension and debarment officer. And there it hovers around, you know, 2 to 3 other staff plus consultants. And then there is the sanctions board, like I said, 7 judges, and they are helped by a professional secretariat of lawyers, and there's the Secretary General, who's Juliana Dunham-Irving, and helped by some very able jurists that have been there for a while. So that's in terms of the staff there. It's also important to mention that those are not the only people that are working on fighting corruption at the World Bank, because there's also all the procurement people and the governance specialists. And that is a different unit, which is called the Governance Global Practice. And there you have people that work on, you know, public sector reform, private sector reform, you know, and the like. Yeah. Then on the length of years, I guess the SNC Lebanon, is that a World Bank monitorship that you're referring to? Yeah. So the long and the short of this, I don't know, because I was not involved in the in that particular decision. As I told you, the ICU is there was also before I was back in with the investigators. But the period that a company is being monitored by the ICO, with or without the help of a outside monitor, will always be the number of years that the company is debarred. So if the company is debarred for 5 years, it will have to work with the ICO for 5 years, yeah, with or without the help of an integrity compliance officer. It's my understanding that integrity compliance officers and the way that they work in the context of NDBs has maybe been a little bit lighter than what one might have seen in the national context, but that's purely my own surmising. Yeah, if you want to make sure you check with the integrity compliance officer, Lisa Miller, I'm sure she'll be delighted to let you know.
If we do have time for one more question that I think it's very interesting, that came here, why just 1/3 of the case are resolved at the sanctions board? Because here in Brazil, people would try to take the case all the way up to the last instance available. What are your feelings about the reasons for that?
Yeah, no, I can see why people are asking the question. So one doesn't really know, right? Unless one would do a survey of all the companies, which to date has not been done. But when I was in the SDO's office, and now you know, the current SDO, which is Jameson Smith, who, you know, we used to work together when I was there. We often wondered whether it was perhaps because many of the cases are fraud cases, right? They're not corruption cases, they're fraud cases. And the evidence that the SDO relies on to decide whether or not there's enough evidence and recommend a sanction, that same evidence goes to the company. Now, fraud is usually pretty easy to prove, right? So the same binders with evidence that the SDO is looking at, those same binders go to the company. And I think when many companies look at the evidence, it's documentary evidence, right? What are you going to do? I mean, I think a lot of companies are like, you know, okay, well, they got us, right? And here it is. And rather than, you know, fighting it in front of the sanctions board, they decide, you know, to take the loss and move on. I mean, that's one possibility, right? And another possibility is, like I said, that, you know, some companies don't want to, from a risk point of view, they're like, okay, we'll take it now rather than, you know, extending it. So that was a something that we thought about. But I agree. I mean, it depends on the you know, the legal culture in a particular, you know, country, right? I've seen companies and I've heard companies like, well, we're going to go, you know, all the way back. Also, I think companies will look at, you know, from a risk point of view, they will compare. You know, by now you can go back, like, you know, what is it, 12, 13 years? How many times was the judgment or the decision from the SEO overturned or not? You know, sometimes, yes. They also will look at, you know, did the sanction recommended or imposed by the sanctions board go up or go down? And there, if you look at the track record, sometimes it goes up. So I think some companies are like, well, you know, we're betting, you know, how we're going to hedge our bets, and they let it go. So, but like I said, unless one does one day a survey of all the companies that have ever been in the bar, you know, we're not really going to know. But it's a very good question for people who are in this business.
Yeah, here in Brazil, the person is caught, you know, running out of a place with a bag full of cash, caught on tape, and they still challenge, right?
Oh, well.
Giovanni, Bruno, any final comments?
No, we are just so ahead of time, and it was a pleasure to have Pascale here. I have to thank her for that and for maintaining you in Brazil, Carlos. It was so good for us. You did so much during this time. So
made very good friends.
Yeah, as Pascale mentioned, these coffee conversations some of those last for life. So those are great. And I would like only to thank you, and it was a real pleasure to having you here, and passing to Bruno.
Thank you very much, and best to all of you, Carlos, Bruno, and Giovanni, as well as everybody listening in. Best to everybody, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Pascale, and the audience. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. Bye-bye.